The forest surrounding Blackwood was a place of whispered legends and forbidden paths. The townsfolk avoided it after dark, muttering about shadows that moved without reason and the eerie cries that echoed through the tangled trees. But the most chilling tale, the one that even the bravest hunters refused to discuss openly, was of the eyes of the crow. It started with a murder long ago, a desperate man accused of witchcraft. Samuel Gray was his name, a recluse who lived on the forest's edge. They said he spoke to birds, carried charms made of bone, and knew too much about the illnesses that plagued the village. When the mayor's son fell ill, suspicion turned to fury. A mob dragged Samuel from his home one moonless night, binding him to the ancient oak at the forest's heart. As the villagers lit their torches, he screamed curses into the dark. His voice rose, guttural and otherworldly, as if something far older spoke through him. "Mark my words," he shrieked. "The eyes that watch will see your sins. The crows will not forget." They left his charred remains beneath the tree, his scorched eyes staring unblinking into the void. Years passed, and the town forgot, or tried to, but the forest never did. 3 centuries later, Blackwood had grown into a bustling little town, modern yet eerily untouched by the passage of time. Roads wound too close to the forest, and houses cast long shadows over its edges. Strange things began to happen, things the town dismissed as coincidence. A boy vanished while playing near the tree line. Search parties found nothing but a single black feather lying on the soft earth. A farmer's livestock were discovered mutilated, their blood pooling into shapes that looked like staring eyes. Then came the sightings. At first, it was harmless. Crows gathered on rooftops, on fences, on the rusting signs that marked the town's borders. But their presence grew. Hundreds, then thousands. The birds perched in rows, their onyx eyes glinting as if they carried the weight of the forest's ancient memory. One by one, people began hearing whispers at night. Not human whispers, but a rustling, guttural sound, like wings brushing against hollow bones. Those who ventured too close to the forest would return with tales of being watched, not by animals, but by something unseen, something intelligent and malicious. Lucy Reed was the first to investigate openly, a journalist visiting Blackwood for a story on urban legends. She dismissed the warnings as superstition. Armed with a camera and a flashlight, she ventured into the woods on a crisp autumn evening. The air was heavy, each step crunching against brittle leaves. The further she went, the darker it became, as if the forest swallowed the light whole. Her flashlight flickered, the beam weak against the oppressive blackness. Then she saw them, eyes. Hundreds of them, glimmering faintly like tiny shards of obsidian, scattered among the branches. She snapped photos, trying to rationalize what she saw. "Just birds," she muttered, though her hands trembled. The silence deepened, and the air grew cold. A faint rustling came from behind her, the sound of wings beating against the windless night. "Who's there?" Lucy called, spinning around. No one answered, but the eyes multiplied, appearing closer and closer. Her flashlight died, leaving her in suffocating darkness. A sharp cry erupted, a mixture of a human scream and the caw of a crow. It was coming from above. Lucy ran, tripping over roots and branches, her breath ragged. The cries followed her, growing louder, surrounding her. She swore she felt claws grazing her back, feathers brushing her face. When she burst from the tree line into the moonlight, she collapsed, shaking, her clothes torn and her camera shattered. The townsfolk found her the next morning, muttering incoherently about the eyes. She refused to speak of what she saw, but her hands were covered in scratches, and in her clenched fist was a blackened human tooth. Lucy Reed never fully recovered from that night in the forest. The scratches on her arms healed, but the terror carved into her mind did not. She moved out of Blackwood a week later, vanishing without a trace. Yet her story lingered, passed around campfires and whispered in hushed tones by those brave enough, or foolish enough, to speak of it. What the town didn't know was that Lucy's encounter had stirred something in the woods. Something old, something hungry. Months passed, and Blackwood tried to forget. The crows remained, but the villagers avoided their gaze, pretending the black-feathered watchers were ordinary birds. Some residents moved away, unable to endure the growing unease. But others stayed, clinging to their homes as if defiance could protect them. Among them was Carter Mills, a schoolteacher in his early 30s. Carter had grown up in Blackwood and scoffed at the tales of the Eyes of the Crow. He taught his students to think rationally, dismissing local legends as tools of fear and control. But beneath his skepticism lay a curiosity he couldn't shake. One evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, Carter found himself staring at the forest from his kitchen window. The crows lined the fence outside, their beady eyes reflecting the dying light. They didn't move, didn't caw, just stared. "You're just birds," he muttered, more to himself than to them. But deep down, a chill twisted his gut. That night, Carter dreamed of the forest. He walked through endless shadows, the trees looming like skeletal sentinels. The air was thick with decay, and the whispers were louder than ever, weaving through his ears in an unintelligible language. He felt unseen eyes boring into him from every direction. When he woke, sweat drenched his body, and his window was open. A single black feather rested on his pillow. The next day, Carter couldn't shake the dream. At school, his students noticed his distracted air, but he brushed off their concern. After his last class, he lingered, watching the children run home under the watchful gaze of the crows. Then he saw her, Emily Green, one of his brightest students, standing alone at the edge of the playground. She was staring into the forest, unmoving. "Emily," Carter called, walking toward her. She didn't respond. When he touched her shoulder, she turned her head slowly, her wide eyes glistening with tears. "They're in there," she whispered. "They are waiting." Carter crouched down, his heart racing. "Who's waiting, Emily?" "The crows," she said simply. Then she looked directly into his eyes, her expression too calm for a child. "And they don't like you." Carter couldn't let it go. That night, he returned to the forest. Armed with a flashlight and an old hunting knife his father had left him, he told himself he'd prove it was all nonsense. The forest swallowed him whole. The trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder with every step, and the silence was deafening. Even the insects were quiet. Then came the eyes. They flickered into existence, one by one, like stars blinking into a moonless sky. Carter froze, his breath hitching. The crows were everywhere, perched silently on branches, their black forms blending into the darkness. But it wasn't just them. Between the trees, other shapes began to move. Tall, spindly figures that didn't belong to any living creature he could name. They shifted like shadows, their movements unnatural, jerking as if bound by strings. Their eyes glowed faintly, mirroring the crow's unblinking gaze. "Who's there?" Carter demanded, his voice trembling. The whispers came, a cacophony of rasping voices. Words he couldn't understand, but their malice was unmistakable. "You do not belong." Carter turned to run, but his legs felt leaden. The ground beneath him shifted, the roots twisting like serpents to trap him. He slashed at them with a knife, his breathing ragged. Something cold brushed his neck, and he spun around. A figure loomed over him, its face obscured but its eyes burning like coals. It raised a hand, long fingers ending in claws, and pointed at him. "Why?" Carter choked out, stumbling backward. The whispers grew louder, drowning his thoughts. He saw flashes, images that burned into his mind. The mob dragging Samuel Gray to the oak tree, the fire consuming his body, the crows circling overhead, their cries merging with his screams. Then came the final image, himself, bound to the same tree, the shadows closing in. Carter woke in his bed, the knife still in his hand. His boots were caked in mud, and his clothes smelled of the forest. He tried to convince himself it was a nightmare, but the black feather on his nightstand said otherwise. He never spoke of what he saw, but the change in him was undeniable. He quit teaching, his once sharp mind dulled by fear. At night, he locked his doors and windows, muttering prayers to gods he didn't believe in. And the crows never left his yard. As weeks turned into months, the forest claimed more victims. People disappeared, some dragged into the woods by invisible forces, others simply vanishing without a trace. Those who returned were never the same, their eyes hollow, their voices quiet. The whispers grew louder, even in the heart of town. The crows multiplied, their numbers so vast that they darkened the sky at dusk. Blackwood was dying, consumed by the curse it had buried centuries ago. And in the heart of the forest, beneath the ancient oak, something stirred. Blackwood was unraveling. The once vibrant town now felt like a husk, hollowed out by fear. Streets were deserted after sundown, curtains drawn tight as whispers echoed through the air. The forest seemed closer than ever, its dark edge creeping into the town like a living thing. The crows were everywhere. They perched on rooftops, telephone poles, and fences, their silent stares drilling into the hearts of those who dared to look back. But worse than the crows were the disappearances. Carter Mills was among the latest. It happened just after the first snowfall. One moment, he was seen bolting down the main street, wild-eyed and muttering about shadows. The next, he was gone, leaving behind only his coat and a trail of blooded feathers. That was when the townsfolk began to flee. Families packed their belongings into cars and abandoned their homes, leaving Blackwood to the crows. But for those who stayed, it became clear that leaving might not be enough. The forest didn't stop at the edge of town. Mary Ann Porter, the town's mayor, was one of the few who refused to leave. She wasn't ready to abandon Blackwood, not after generations of a family had lived there. But the forest had other plans. Late one evening, she stood on her porch, clutching a lantern. The town square was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the scent of decay. She watched as the crows gathered in the center of the square, their numbers forming an unbroken black mass. Then came the sound. It started as a low rustling, like wind moving through dry leaves, but there was no wind. The sound grew louder, sharper, turning into whispers that wrapped around her like invisible chains. Mary Ann's lantern flickered, and she gripped it tighter. A single crow broke from the flock, landing just a few feet from her. Its eyes gleamed with unnatural intelligence. "You need to stop this," she shouted, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" The crow tilted its head, studying her. Then it spoke, not in a voice, but in her mind. The whispers coalesced into words, ancient and cold. "Blood. Restitution. The debt remains unpaid." Marian staggered back, the lantern slipping from her grasp and shattering on the ground. The whispers surged, and she saw them, the faces of those who had vanished, their empty eyes staring back at her. They were bound by shadowy tendrils, their mouths open in silent screams. "Please," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "What can I do?" The crow cawed sharply, and the whispers stopped. The mass of crows parted, revealing a path that led directly into the forest. Marianne knew she had no choice. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and the courage born of desperation, she stepped into the woods. The air grew colder with each step, the trees closing in around her like a prison. The ground beneath her feet was soft and damp, and she realized it wasn't dirt but ash. She followed the path for what felt like hours, her flashlight flickering as if it, too, was afraid. Then she saw it. The ancient oak loomed before her, its twisted branches clawing at the sky. The surrounding ground was littered with bones, both human and animal, and the bark was blackened with old scars. At its base stood a figure, a man cloaked in shadow, his face obscured but his eyes glowing with the same cold fire as the crows. "Samuel Gray," Marianne whispered. The figure nodded. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice breaking. Samuel raised a hand, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Images flooded her mind, his body burning, the mob cheering, the crows circling overhead. She saw the centuries of suffering that followed, the forest feeding on the fear and blood of the town. "They must pay," the whispers said. "The debt is not yet fulfilled." Marian fell to her knees. "How do I end this?" Samuel pointed to the oak tree, and she understood. The roots of the tree were wrapped around a charred skeleton, its bony fingers clutching the soil. The remains of Samuel Gray. Marian worked through the night, digging with her bare hands until her fingers bled. She unearthed the bones, each one blackened by fire but still intact. As she pulled the last bone free, the ground trembled, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The crows descended, a swirling mass of wings and claws, but they didn't attack. Instead, they circled her, their cries blending into a single, piercing scream. "Release me," Samuel's voice said, clear and powerful. Marianne hesitated, then took the remains to the center of the clearing. She whispered a prayer, though she didn't know to whom, and set the bones ablaze with a match from her pocket. The fire burned bright and blue, consuming the remains in seconds. The whispers stopped. The crows let out one final call and vanished into the night, leaving only silence. The next morning, the forest felt different. The air was lighter, the oppressive darkness gone. Marianne returned to the town, her body aching but her heart hopeful. But Blackwood was empty. Every house, every street, was abandoned. The townsfolk were gone, leaving no trace behind. Marianne was the only one left, a lone survivor in a place that had been consumed by its sins. She stayed in Blackwood, tending to the empty town as if it might someday come alive again. The crows never returned, and the forest remained quiet. But on moonless nights, she swore she could hear whispers, faint and distant, like a memory that refused to fade.